Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Some very exciting buzz on the transfer portal side of things for the Nebraska Cornhuskers is not only are things sounding like they're heating up with quarterback Kyle McCord from Ohio State, they also seem to be heating up for one of his top wide receivers at Ohio State as well, Julian Fleming. Want to kind of provide an update on my thoughts, Kyle McCord, Julian Fleming, also introduce a few other targets that I think the Nebraska Cornhuskers should be going after throughout the next couple of weeks. Really excited to get into this one. We talked a little bit about it the last couple of days, but it does seem to sound like Nebraska might be zeroing in on Kyle McCord. Want to give you guys some more of my thoughts. Before we do, just want to say thank you to you guys and a special shout out to the Nebraska fans. Many of you guys know I love talking this program, love talking Coach Rhule, but the amount of support you guys show consistently to the boys, it really does mean a lot. If y'all do enjoy the content, you enjoy the updates, consider subscribing to the channel. I think it's going to be a busy next couple of weeks for the Nebraska Cornhuskers. Without further ado, let's get into this one. And we talked about Nebraska targeting a couple of quarterbacks in the transfer portal, Kyle McCord being one of them. You had Blake Shapen, you had Cam Ward, you had Sam Levitt from Michigan State. And it does sound like Kyle McCord might be the number one quarterback for the Nebraska Cornhuskers on their board. And kind of want to dive a little bit more into Kyle McCord and then get to Julian Fleming, who is an extremely exciting wide receiver, also from the Ohio State Buckeyes. But starting with Kyle McCord, I think the national media gives Kyle McCord a bad rep. When you look at Kyle McCord as a starting quarterback in 2023, he went 11-1. His only loss was on the road to the Michigan Wolverines, the number one team in the country, by 6 points. You take a look at some of his numbers, a 65% completion percentage, over 3,000 yards, 24 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. And you're a Nebraska fan, you're looking at that 6 interception mark and saying, yeah, we need some of that in Lincoln. Now, we said from a fit standpoint, maybe Kyle McCord, not necessarily the cleanest fit in what we saw Nebraska's offense in 2023, which liked to use the quarterback in the run game a lot. Kyle McCord, not necessarily the biggest threat with his legs. What I would say to that is, I think Nebraska went more to that quarterback run in 2023 because they kind of had to, right? You looked at that depth chart and the injuries that it had at the running back spot, at the wide receiver spot, and at the quarterback spot. The passing game just wasn't there, right? It was some quarterbacks that weren't playing very good football, to be honest, and that's not trying to be disrespectful. The quarterback play lacked for Nebraska. That's why they're going out into the transfer portal. But another part of that was the wide receiver room was decimated with injuries. I mean, the starting wide receivers towards the end of the year were a lot of true freshmen and Alex Bullock. And so you look at the passing attack, and I think Nebraska would have liked to throw the ball and get more aggressive down the field more, but they couldn't really do it because the personnel, they were just too banged up. And so you bring Kyle McCord into this Nebraska offense. Yes, will you see the read options and more quarterback running in 2024 with Kyle McCord? Probably not. But what you're going to get is a much more two-dimensional offense where teams have to respect Kyle McCord and what he can do from the pocket. You have a little background on Kyle McCord. There was a reason he was a top 50 national prospect coming out of high school, one of the more sought-after quarterbacks in his high school recruiting class. He's a big body that has an extremely good arm, and the ball placement is really good for Kyle McCord. I mean, a 64% completion percentage, and I think the narrative around Kyle McCord is that he's not a good quarterback because he's getting compared to guys like Justin Fields and CJ Stroud, the quarterbacks that came before him at Ohio State. And is Kyle McCord a Justin Fields? No, he's probably not, but he's also a very good college football player that just led Ohio State to an 11-1 season with, again, their only loss being to the Michigan Wolverines. Many of you guys know my take on Kyle McCord. I want to talk about a little bit more of an interesting developing story, and that's the wide receiver Julian Fleming, who also has mutual interest in the Nebraska Cornhuskers. If you guys have been kind of following some of the talking points I've had for this Nebraska team and some of their big priorities in the transfer portal, a lot of my talking points were they need to get some experience in that wide receiver room. I mean, they were down to a lot of true freshmen who were having to be forced to play during their true freshman year for Nebraska due to injuries. And you look at that wide receiver room heading into 2024, they got to add some bodies. And Julian Fleming, Ohio State fans know this when they've been listening to me, is one of my favorite and I'm a Michigan fan, one of my favorite wide receivers in the country. And the reason that is Julian Fleming, I mean, for a little background here, top 5 national prospect out of the 2020 class, bona fide five-star according to all the recruiting services, and for good reason. I mean, 6'2", 210 pounds, was an elite basketball player, was an elite track and field guy. He kind of checks all the boxes. Big physical frame that can run some routes, and that is, I mean, the size and speed that he has, that's what makes him different. That's what makes him a wide receiver with so much capability. And the reason I love Julian Fleming so much is he came to an Ohio State wide receiver room that he just kind of got buried. And you see a lot of guys who are hitting the transfer portal maybe just weren't necessarily good enough to crack the starting lineup. Julian Fleming sat behind Garrett Wilson, who was a first-round NFL draft pick, Chris Olave, first-round NFL draft pick, Jackson Smith-Njigba, first-round NFL draft pick, and Marvin Harrison Jr., who's going to be probably a top 5 draft pick come this NFL draft. And so Julian Fleming continued to stick around at Ohio State for 4 years, kind of just waiting for his opportunity. And so you look at those kind of players in this modern era. I love the fact that Julian Fleming sat there for 4 years, continued to battle, ended up having a solid career at Ohio State. This is a guy that wasn't necessarily on the bench his whole career, caught 79 passes for 963 yards, 7 touchdowns, and showed flashes of why he's a true 5-star. And you look at Julian Fleming in this wide receiver room, I think he's by far the wide receiver 1 heading into 2024. He has that chemistry with Kyle McCord. You look at the potential swing here for the Nebraska Cornhuskers, landing a quarterback that I think massively upgrades this Nebraska passing attack, and a wide receiver that steps on campus and in my mind is going to be a wide receiver 1. That would be massive for Nebraska. We spent a large part of the season talking about how one-dimensional this Nebraska team was. And yes, they're going to still continue to run the ball. That is what Matt Rhule wants to do. That's what he said is this Cornhuskers identity. But you got to have some semblance of passing attack, or you're going to see loaded boxes all game. And Kyle McCord, Julian Fleming would be a duo that gives you a much upgraded and much needed upgrade passing attack and passing threat in this offense. Kyle McCord and Julian Fleming coming to Lincoln would be absolutely massive. And again, when you have so much talent in your wide receiver room like Nebraska, Malachi Coleman, Jaden Doss, Jalen Lloyd, these guys are going to be good. What's the best way to supplement a young wide receiving core that needs some more experience? Bringing in a guy that's a 4-year player at Ohio State. We all know how good they are at developing wide receivers. You're going to get a really polished veteran wide receiver with Julian Fleming, who has massive upside in what he can be if he gets his shot as a wide receiver 1 in that offense. Kyle McCord, Julian Fleming, 2 massive targets for the Nebraska Cornhuskers. I want to talk about 3 other guys that I think Nebraska should be at least kicking the tires on. And if you've been kind of following the commentary around Nebraska in the transfer portal, there's a little bit of a numbers crunch. They're focusing on the high school class. They're bringing in a very large high school class, I should say, and it's a loaded one too. And so they're not going to go and get 30 guys in the transfer portal. That's not how Matt Rhule wants to run things at Lincoln, and I have a lot of respect for it. And I think it is the right avenue in terms of constructing this roster. But there are some guys that I think you can add through the portal that make this team more competitive in 2024. Another guy I want to talk about is Miles Price from Texas Tech. And the reason I'm keying in on Miles Price is Billy Kemp, provided a lot of value when he was healthy in this Nebraska offense. And I think he didn't really have quite the opportunity in year that we all thought he'd have because of the inconsistency in the quarterback play. But Miles Price is a guy that is extremely productive playing that similar role, that short intermediate guy that's going to be a quarterback's best friend that takes a little pressure off the quarterback. He's going to get open quick. He's going to create after the catch. Miles Price, 161 catches, 1,700 yards, 10 touchdowns over his career at Texas Tech, has been playing since a true freshman, a guy that was slept on, a little under the radar coming out of high school football in Texas. I think this kind of has Matt Rhule written all over him. And again, an experienced wide receiver that kind of fills in that Billy Kemp role, I think would be huge for the Nebraska Cornhuskers in 2023. And then on the offensive line, which we spent a lot of time talking about in terms of if there's the biggest thing to be optimistic about in terms of the Matt Rhule era at Nebraska, there's a lot of things to be optimistic about. But my number one thing is you saw this offensive line get better. And it dealt with a lot of injuries. It looked bad in week 1, but it got better during the season. That's something you never really saw during that Scott Frost era. And so you're seeing a little bit more development on that offensive line, but that's not to say they can't add some bodies into this Nebraska offensive line group. Easton Kitty, another guy that has Matt Rhule written all over him. Guy that was under-recruited out of high school, goes to North Dakota, has played really good football, has notched offers from Texas A&M and a couple other P5 programs as he's hit the portal. A guy that can play tackle, that guy that can play guard, providing you that position versatility and depth. 377 pass rush sets, only gave up 10 pressures. Again, so you bring in a guy like Kyle McCord, you want to bring in an offensive lineman that's going to be able to give some pass protection. Easton Kitty, I think, is probably a day one starter for Nebraska and would provide a massive asset on that offensive line for Nebraska. And the last guy I want to talk about, you're going to recognize the last name, even if you don't recognize the guy. PrinceLEU Milan, the older brother of Prince Will, who obviously plays for Nebraska. He hits the transfer portal coming from the Florida Gators, and he's going to be a hot commodity. He was probably the best defensive player for the Florida Gators. Now, a couple things that I think are working in Nebraska's way. One, PrinceLEU tweeted at Prince Will saying, hey, what if we played together? Something along those lines. I don't follow Twitter that closely, but he tweeted at Prince Will. So obviously there's maybe a little bit of interest with playing with his little brother. And you also have a few guys who came from the Florida Gators that Matt Rhule got in the transfer portal last year. So there are some connections to Lincoln. Now, PrinceLEU is going to be a hot commodity because you look at the numbers. During his career, 24.5 tackles for loss, 14.5 sacks. This year, 11.5 TFL, 7 sacks. This is probably the best player on this Florida Gators defense, has played at an extremely high level in the SEC. But, man, you look at what Tony White's done, especially with this defense and on that defensive line, and you add PrinceLEU, and you have Cam Leonard, and you have Prince Will, and you have Ty Robinson and Nash Hutchmaker coming back. You add this will probably be the best pure pass rusher on this Nebraska defense. I mean, is it crazy to say this Nebraska defense doesn't take more steps in 2024, second year under Tony White, adding a pass rusher like PrinceLEU? Now, again, not necessarily saying there's a lot of traction here, but I did want to actually offer the name up because there is a little bit of buzz and a little bit of smoke with the U brothers being together in Lincoln. These are the latest updates here. And again, I don't expect Matt Rhule to grab 30, 20 players in the transfer portal, but I do expect Nebraska to be a selective buyer in the transfer portal at the quarterback position, at the wide receiver position, and on the offensive line. And if you can add PrinceLEU, I mean, the optimism about Nebraska in 2024 under Coach Matt Rhule has to be really exciting. Again, appreciate the Nebraska fans rocking with the boys. We'll continue to update you guys as some more information comes. I wanted to hop on, talk a little Huskers football again. The support you guys have always shown means a lot to the boys. If you do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.